Happy Sunday, everyone, and happy Easter for those joining us live. Today, I want to talk a little bit about something that I'm going to get into more on a future musing, and that is this question of modern idolatry. And so I'm going to go deeper on it in another episode. I'm only going to touch lightly on it here. But I was thinking this morning about my mission. And so I served a mission in Honduras. And as is common in many Latin American countries, when I would go around introducing myself to people, getting to know people, whenever we would attempt to discuss with them a theological issue, a scripture verse, or whatever, the reply was often, "Oh, I'm Catholic. You know, my parents are Catholic. My grandparents were Catholic. That's just the way things are." And so many of these people could not imagine being or doing anything different. It was their identity. It's just the way things were. And so it got me thinking, how many things in our lives do we accept and do and resist changing just because it's the way we were brought up? It's what we've always known. We have these biases, what we might call in our faith the traditions of the fathers. The scriptures over and over again criticize the traditions of the fathers, this kind of abstract set of ideas or actions or beliefs that past generations clung to and passed down to their children and grandchildren. Of course, in the Book of Mormon, right, we got the descendants of Laman who feel like the birthright was stolen from them, and they pass that down to their posterity, creating wars for generations based on this faulty premise at the beginning. So the Book of Mormon, the scriptures more broadly, are full of examples of traditions of the fathers impeding people from being righteous, from having peace, from loving one another. There's this scripture in modern revelation that says, "The wicked one cometh, and the adversary taketh away light and truth through disobedience from the children of men, and because of the traditions of their fathers. So I've commanded you to bring up your children in light and truth." So this contrast between, hey, God's saying, like, I want to give you more truth, more light, more revelation, line upon line. What's standing in your way? The traditions of your fathers. And I feel like there are many instances in which we read the scriptures, we look at the Israelites or the Lamanites or whoever, and we say, "Oh, you silly people. You just kept clinging to the traditions of your fathers. How naive were you? We're so much more sophisticated. These problems don't apply to us." And of course they do, but we fail to actually apply them. We like to compartmentalize a bit and look at these spiritually unsophisticated peoples from long ago, supposedly unsophisticated compared to us, and believe that we are immune to these issues, or that they don't apply to any degree that would require us to challenge our own assumptions or scrutinize our own actions. So there are lots of directions where we could go with this topic of looking at our own traditions that have been passed down to us. Today, I want to focus on the Pledge of Allegiance. Like most of you, I went to a government school. I stood up every morning. I put my hand over my heart and I recited this thing that I was told to recite. I memorized it at an early age, like we all did, had no clue what it meant. And you know, all throughout my life, that has been expected of me as it's been expected of you. I remember just a few weeks ago, I was in a meeting, political meeting, and I stood. I don't like to cause a scene. I don't actually no. In this case, I did not stand. I was with my kids, and we just remained seated, which is rare. I usually will just not try and draw attention, but in this case, we remained seated. And afterwards, it was actually a caucus meeting, and so no one was running. So I got nominated to run to be a delegate, and this older guy, in his 60s, maybe is in his 70s. They're asking questions of the various people to see what you stand for and what you believe, and whether they should vote for you as a delegate. And this gentleman is like, "I want to know from Connor why he didn't pledge allegiance to the flag." And so in like 30 seconds, I gave my answer, and I was not elected to that position, which I'm frankly totally, completely fine with. But it was because he could not fathom, and many other people presumably, that I would not pledge allegiance. Why? this cultural expectation, when in fact I believe we need to analyze and scrutinize our actions. And so often when we analyze them, we need to understand their history. So that's where I want to start. I want to start with the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, which from my experience now in about 12, 13 years of not pledging allegiance to the flag, I have found that hardly anyone knows the history of the Pledge of Allegiance. They do it, they know it, the pledge rather, they regurgitate it, they feel, warm butterflies or I don't know what when they say it, brings back nostalgia from when they were a kid, I don't know, but they don't know so often the history. Well, the pledge comes to us from Francis Bellamy. Francis Bellamy was what he called a Christian socialist. He believed that Jesus was a socialist. He was compadres, you might say, with his cousin, Edward Bellamy. So Francis and Edward Bellamy were kind of co-conspirators in this Christian nationalist socialist effort in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Well, Edward, his cousin, was a writer. In fact, he wrote a couple books. One was extremely popular. It was called Looking Backward. And being socialists, Edward wrote this book where the setting takes place in the year 2000. And so it describes this future in which all industries are nationalized. There's kind of this socialist utopia. And so it's this book that sets up this future. And the intent of Bellamy writing it was to paint this vivid picture for people in America to say, this is what we could have and things would be great. Let's head in this direction. Well, there was an individual who called Edward Bellamy, again, this is the cousin before we get back to Francis. There was an individual who called Edward Bellamy a great American prophet. And that individual is John Dewey. And if that name does not kind of give you a little bit of a gag reflex, it should, and that means you don't know enough of your history about who John Dewey is. Well, John Dewey, is basically the father of modern industrial schooling, the modern government school system. And so I write all about him in Passion-Driven Education. You can look up your own stuff. But John Dewey was also a socialist. He was an atheist. He was not Christian like the Bellamys. And he was kind of the architect of compulsory schooling in a lot of ways with some of his cohorts like Horace Mann. So here's what John Dewey said about Edward Bellamy's book. Again, this kind of socialist utopia book called Looking Backward. He said, what Uncle Tom's Cabin was to the anti-slavery movement, Bellamy's book may well be to the shaping of popular opinion for a new social order. A new social order. Of course, we've heard that for decades. But what did John Dewey mean when he said that? Well, he was a secular humanist. And in his book, My Pedagogic Creed, where John Dewey explains the thinking of the time, which was shared by the Bellamys. So this is a little bit of backstory to paint a more vivid picture about the approach that the Bellamys were taking. John Dewey, an ideological compadre, said that I believe that every teacher should realize the dignity of his calling, that he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. I believe that in this way, the teacher always is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. Now, why would an atheist write that? Well, his God was government. It was this social order. It was the manipulation of malleable clay, turning the people into this product that they wanted. It was the state. That is what John Dewey believed. That is what Edward Bellamy believed, and that is what his cousin Francis Bellamy believed as well. So Edward was the writer. He wrote Looking Backward, very popular book. Francis was more the doer. Okay, so they're cousins. They're ideologically like-minded. Edward is popularizing this stuff through writing. Francis is more of an activist, you might say. And so at the time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you got to think we're coming off of the Civil War, and you've got Reconstruction and all this stuff. And there's this new national identity, and it's a national identity of nationalism. It is that we are We cannot be broken apart. The North won. The South is not allowed to secede. We are one nation, and that is what we are. So the nationalists were very kind of concerted in their efforts to organize and to advance this new ethos or mythos that organized people and gave them this worldview. All across the country, there were nationalist clubs promoting this worldview. And so Francis Bellamy in the late 1800s, he's networking with a lot of these different groups. And he ends up networking with the National Education Association. Of course, for those of us who work in education reform, the NEA is well known. They finance all kinds of things to keep government a coercive monopoly and deter any type of competition. And so this is in the late 1800s. The NEA organizes with Francis Bellamy what they called the National Public School Celebration. Now, mind you, this is in the late 1800s. Things have not kind of proliferated to the degree they have today when it comes to coercive, compulsory schooling, this kind of industrial process. This was in the beginning stages where they're trying to promote this. They want the government to have more charge of children's education. And I'll get into this in just a moment, but it's specifically because they saw the state's domination of the education of the rising generation as the vehicle through which to shape this social order. And Francis Bellamy was very much a part of that. So Francis Bellamy gets made chairman of this event. Again, 1892, working with the National Education Association. Francis Bellamy is now in charge of this big event. And the agenda of this event is basically what was laid out in a magazine called The Youth's Companion. Think of this as an early boy's life, like you see now in the Boy Scouts of America, or Highlights, this kind of youth magazine. And Francis is contributing a lot of content there. And so at this event, with all these young people from across the country, and education pioneers, you might call them, progressive nationalist type people. Francis says that the training of citizens in the common knowledge and the common duties of citizenship belongs irrevocably to the state. Okay? Basically, raising the rising generation, training them with knowledge and duties of citizenship belongs irrevocably to the state. Now, if you know anything about estate planning, for example, if you have an irrevocable trust, or even if you just understand language pretty well, you know that irrevocable means you cannot revoke. Again, it's like this nationalist post-Civil War idea that you're not allowed to leave. The union is irrevocable, right? This duty of basically politically indoctrinating the rising generation, according to Francis Bellamy, belongs irrevocably to the state. So he drafts a pledge. Francis Bellamy, he drafts a pledge to be recited at the event. And then it's promoted in the Youth's Companion magazine. And that is the genesis of today's Pledge of Allegiance, born out of this nationalist, socialist effort to empower the state, to have influence over young people, to shape the social order of the future. And of course, you know, kids, as I said earlier, like in my case, regurgitating it without knowing anything about it, not understanding what's involved or why. And Francis got this idea from the post-war loyalty oaths. So after the war, in exchange for a presidential pardon for their treasonous crimes, Southerners were basically forced into making loyalty oaths, pledging their allegiance to the government. And that was not just this nice little classroom thing or whatever. Like, it was like, you know, do or die in a sense, where your fate was conditioned on affirming allegiance to the government. And that is where Francis got the idea. Let's not just do this with you know, Southern war veterans. Let's do this with children. Let's cultivate their understanding about the quote unquote duties of citizenship by having similar loyalty oaths. And when Francis wrote this pledge and began spreading it, it was very similar to what we have today. Only minor changes have been made. Under God was added, for example, many, many decades later. So at first, the pledge just said one nation, indivisible. Because again, in this post-Civil War era, that was what the nationalists were promoting. You cannot leave. We are one union. This is the way it needs to be. And, you know, secession, of course, after the Southerners were defeated, was completely frowned on. There was no more consent of the governed because consent requires dissent. And so the Civil War and the decades that followed and efforts such as Francis's were a radical shift from what America used to be. Complete different country. No longer was it a confederation of sovereign states. It is now a nationalist, top-down governed monolithic state. And Francis and others were promoting that same worldview. So why do I bring this up? Well, it's important to know the history. So, I mean, from there, Francis, he publishes it in the magazine. They're promoting it. Again, he's an activist. He's working with all kinds of states and school boards, trying to make it compulsory, trying to, get it into the schools. And he succeeded bit by bit by bit by bit. And did you know, you can actually find photos of this from pre-World War II, but pledging to the flag from when Francis Bellamy started it all the way through World War II era, it was what we now today regard as the Nazi salute. Hand extended, palm down, fingers extended, right? Facing and pointing to the flag. And that is how American children for decades pledged allegiance to the flag. Well, when the Nazis rose to power and that was their salute, it was deemed as a bit politically unsavory. And so Congress went in and changed the method by which we are required, in some cases, to pledge allegiance to the flag. Okay, so how does this relate to traditions of our fathers? I feel like allegiance is a very significant thing. And so the question to me is, where does our allegiance lie? I think words matter. I think words program our mind and our heart. I think words and thoughts that precede them are the operating system of our brain. And, that's why negative self-talk can be very difficult. You're programming your brain to think that way versus kind of positive self-talk or whatever. That the thoughts we form, the words that we express are kind of a programming language to program our actions, our attitudes, our beliefs. And so I don't think it is a simple thing to cultivate children to regurgitate words they don't understand, to pledge allegiance to things they can't possibly comprehend. I think that is a ideologically significant, culturally shifting way to program an entire generation and their attitudes towards the state. And it's not that this is just some theory. That was actual intent. That is what Francis was trying to do. That's what Edward and John Dewey and others wanted. It's why they dominated the schools. It's why they pushed for compulsory education. It's why these efforts were targeted to young people and not to adults. So this isn't some fanciful theory. It was the actual intent of those who started this. And so when we talk about the traditions of our fathers, I think it's important to understand the intent of those who started entire generations of millions of people down this path. It's important to know what they wanted and what their motives were. But we know that no man can serve two masters. So when we express our allegiance to anything but God, I think those are dangerous words. Even if we're not, bowing down on our knees and reverencing a flag or doing anything like crazy like you might think from, polytheistic societies of past generations, what matters is what's in our heart, right? We don't have to have these grandiose, idolatrous behaviors that might make us think, it's a cult or you're being idolatrous to a competing God. What matters is our heart. And where is our allegiance? Is it to this patriotic, nationalistic identity, or is it to God? Do we have an eye single to the glory of God, or do we also have an eye on old glory as well? So in my mind, allegiance, so I wrote a post on my blog. I used to blog like in 2010. I wrote, why I don't pledge allegiance to the flag anymore. And I kind of explained some of this. And then 4 years later, I followed up with another article where I said, I had a modified pledge. In 2010, it was like, I pledge allegiance to the Constitution. And that's kind of where my thinking was at the time. Not to a flag, not to a government, but to the principles, right? The values. And then I was like, no, not even that. Like I pledge allegiance to God, period. I think I also said in that post, I pledge allegiance to my family, which I think is a subset of the divine order. But I think about this when it comes to like patriotic hymns. The whole ward stands up in church and sings the Star-Spangled Banner for the 4th of July, or whatever the Sunday is that falls just before or after the 4th of July. Or heaven help us, sometimes we sing God Saves the King, or the Star-Spangled Banner, and everyone stands up and feels great. And my family sits there with lasers on our backs, and we don't sing. And I think it is completely inappropriate to sing these political Caesarean hymns, if you can even use that word. I think of hymn as like sacred music, not as like these, political songs. I don't think these have any place. In fact, I'm very pleased that the new hymn book that the church has been working on apparently will omit these patriotic hymns. Maybe they're doing it because they want like one hymn to rule them, or one hymn book to rule them all, and with different countries having differing things in an international church, maybe it makes less sense. So perhaps their decision was more pragmatic than theological or political, as mine would be here, or my interpretation is. Nevertheless, I think it's a good thing. Having flags in the church. I remember decades ago, what was it? It was like I think it was like the centennial celebration of the American government forming or whatever. And so Pioneer Era, the Salt Lake Temple, they hung this massive American flag on the side of the temple, and just stuff like that. I think it's problematic because it directs our allegiance elsewhere. We are not citizens of a state. We are children of God. And if we allow ourselves to be divided into this tribalistic, competitive fashion where we all have our different banners and chants and whatever, it's a way to divide us and not unite us. And so that's where, again, I'll focus on a later episode about how nationalism and patriotism play into modern idolatry. But the flag is central to that. I think the pledge is also hollow, right? Tyrants say the Pledge of Allegiance. Horrible people trying to destroy our rights say the Pledge of Allegiance. It's done nothing to secure liberty and justice for all. Nothing. And yet I think it has helped create this type of almost like Borg-like collectivism where people mindlessly think, oh, we're pledging allegiance. Oh, we're singing the Star Spangled Banner. Oh, we're all on the same team. When in fact, many of the people saying the same pledge and doing the same things are trying to eviscerate the principles upon which our country was founded. And so I don't think it has deterred anything good. And I think it probably has done some bad things by almost like plugging people into this trance-like state of thinking like, oh, he's patriotic, let's elect him, or he looks good and he's one of us. And so I don't think that it's been effective at all. So then what is its purpose if it is not a way to inculcate principles that we might actually adhere to and defend? So I'm going to share a story now that I share in Christ versus Caesar. For those of you who have read it, parts of it will be familiar. If you haven't yet read this book, a lot of what I talk about in these musings is distilled down more succinctly in Christ versus Caesar. So you can check that out. But this story starts in 1940. And it's in this town of Richfield, Illinois, this rural town. And there's some Jehovah Witnesses there who are being chased. They're being chased for, I think it was like 2 miles in this tiny town that had around 7,000 people in it. And they corner these Jehovah Witnesses and they start beating them. The men are taken over to this vehicle where they have the American flag draped across the hood, and they shove this guy into the hood and they start beating him. And this wasn't just religious bigotry. That's not what was happening here. This was a direct response to the Jehovah Witnesses' political views and the allegation that they were being insufficiently patriotic. And so the chief of police actually sat nearby, the chief of the police of this town, thousands of people. He actually watched this unfold as they're banging this guy's head against the vehicle. Why? Because he did not salute or pledge to the flag. And that day there were 64 Jehovah Witnesses that were beaten. And this was not an isolated event. This is one of many altercations all across the country where an estimated 1,500 or so Jehovah Witnesses were beaten by people, were assaulted in 335 separate attacks. One reporter said that the outburst of violence was unparalleled in America since the attack on the Mormons, decades prior, or like a century prior. And this was not just from like some vigilantes, people who were just getting upset and getting drunk or whatever and taking out on people. This was kind of an establishment view from a lot of people. So here is one newspaper editorial in Jackson, Mississippi, They said that departure under pressure of a colony of Jehovah's Witnesses camped on the Pocahontas Road just beyond the city limits was proper disposal of what threatened to become a serious situation. There is no room in Jackson or vicinity for any person who will not salute the American flag and openly says he will not fight for his country under any circumstances. It so happens that sturdy citizens of Jackson don't believe in nonsense of that sort and will not tolerate its existence in or near this community. Okay, so how did all these attacks happen? Why were the Jehovah's Witnesses being attacked for not saluting or pledging to the flag? Well, would you believe me if I said it started because of a third grader? 5 years prior to these attacks, there was this third grader named Carlton, and he refused to pledge allegiance to the flag. He and his family were Jehovah's Witnesses, and just months prior, their church's president, his name was Joseph Rutherford, he had argued that pledging allegiance to the flag was tantamount to worshiping a graven image, which of course is condemned in the Bible. Rutherford, the head of the Jehovah's Witnesses church, said that the nations of the world are under the control of Satan the devil. Psst, our church leaders have said the same thing. And that requiring a child of God to salute the national flag compels that person to salute the devil as the invisible God of the nation. And so Carlton's 8 years old, he's in third grade, and he starts getting targeted by his teacher, and so the principal comes in to intervene. And he didn't intervene in Carlton's favor, quite the opposite. The principal said, "I will stand for no such insult to the American flag." So Carlton's dad and associate who was there to support were both hauled off to jail. So Rutherford, the head of the Jehovah's Witnesses, finds out about this, and he's got, I think it was like a radio show or something, but he's got a little bit of a bully pulpit, and he shines a spotlight on what happened to Carlton. Well, within a year after that, 120 children, more than 120, were expelled from school all across the country, Jehovah's Witness kids, because they were not saluting to the flag. They were following this kind of call of their church president to abstain from doing that. And Rutherford wanted to press this matter in court because he thought that this was a violation of the First Amendment. And this is important. His point was not to cause a problem. So what he said was that refusing to salute the flag did not convey a disrespect of the flag or for the country, but a proper respect and obedience to Almighty God. And so he was talking about how, caught between the laws of God and the laws of man, they were going to follow the laws of God. I mean, the Bible says we should do exactly that. Here are the Jehovah's Witnesses trying to follow suit. So Carlton's family sued, and they wanted to get Carlton back in school. He was expelled. Went all the way up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and they dismissed the claim. They basically upheld lower rulings that justified the expulsion. So here's what these lawyers in black robes said. "There is nothing in the salute or the Pledge of Allegiance which constitutes an act of idolatry, or which approaches to any religious observance. It does not in any reasonable sense hurt, molest, or restrain a human being in respect to worshiping God within the meanings of the words of the Constitution. The rule and the statute are well within the competency of legislative authority. They exact nothing in opposition to religion. They are directed to a justifiable end in the conduct of education in the public schools." So courts elsewhere started saying similar things in other court cases where Jehovah's Witnesses were challenging what was happening. And keep in mind, these are in state Supreme Courts, right? Because these are bubbling up in different states. The New Jersey Supreme Court, this is in 1937, so 2 years after Carlton had that first incident, said that the pledge is by no stretch of the imagination a religious rite, but rather a patriotic ceremony. The California Supreme Court said that the flag salute was one of the social and patriotic duties of citizens required to maintain good order, safety, and the public welfare of the nation. And then forcing young kids to pledge allegiance to the flag, they said, tends to stimulate in their minds sentiments of lasting affection and respect for and unflattering loyalty to our government and its institutions. Okay, so more conflict, more fights, more kids not pledging allegiance. This stuff starts to bubble up. And pretty soon there's a kid named, actually two siblings, Lillian and Billy. And so this is the year following. They're also not pledging allegiance. They also get expelled. Their case goes before a judge who happens to be a Quaker. And if you know anything about Quakers in early America, there's, some strong sympathies within that faith for religious freedom and tolerance. So this was that judge's decision in a separate case. The flag salute by children who are sincerely opposed to it upon conscientious religious grounds is not a reasonable method of teaching civics, but tends to have the contrary effect upon such children. Our country's safety surely does not depend upon the totalitarian idea of forcing all citizens into one common mold of thinking and acting, or requiring them to render a lip service of loyalty in a manner which conflicts with their sincere convictions. So the case gets appealed and goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court now. And they overturned that ruling and upheld the right of schools to expel children who did not pledge allegiance. It was an 8-1 opinion. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, this is in 1940, asserted that the state can insist on inculcation of loyalty. Inculcation, if you don't know, means kind of a indoctrination, if you will, a kind of cultivation. So he's saying that the state can require loyalty of kids. And so final thing that I'll mention here is it was that Supreme Court ruling in 1940 that led to all the violence. Okay, because people started attacking the Jehovah's Witnesses, and when one sheriff was asked by a reporter why the witnesses were being run out of town, here's what the sheriff, an officer of the law meant to uphold people's constitutional rights, he said, "Well, they're traitors. The Supreme Court says so. Ain't you heard?" And so emboldened by that 8-1 ruling saying that schools can expel children for not pledging allegiance, all this violence erupted against Jehovah's Witnesses across the country. I've shared before on a previous musing my respect for Jehovah's Witnesses in sticking to the principles of their faith in contrast to civic duties imposed upon them by others. You look at the example in Nazi Germany, and similarly there, as in America, they said, we're not saluting your flag. We're not joining your military to go fight in wars and things like that. We are here to follow God. And of course, they were decimated for it and thrown in prison and executed. Meanwhile, members of our faith and many others ingratiated themselves and went along to get along and we're part of the new civic religion. We can meld. We can, just like the early Israelites were constantly taking things from the kind of polytheistic societies that surrounded them and polluting their own faith. I mean, over and over again, there's prophets in the Israelite societies that are like, you guys got to stop taking all this Baal worship and all this crap that you see and worshiping up in the groves and all these things and incorporating it into their faith. We do the same thing. We do the same thing. We are not immune from it. We are not more sophisticated than them. If anything, it's more subtle today. It's more pronounced. It's more socially appropriate. And we do so many of the same things. But we just don't apply that to ourselves. So is flag allegiance idolatry? Again, saving the broader discussion about modern idolatry for a later musing, and I'll hopefully do this one soon. I do want to point out the flag code, which is the federal law that governs how flags can be used and how they should be used. Here's what this is federal law. This says, the flag represents a living country and is itself considered a living thing. What? Federal law regarding the United States flag says that it is considered a living thing. I mean, that sounds kind of culty to me and kind of weird. And look, I mean, in Israelite society, one of the things that I mentioned the groves, another thing they were often doing was lifting up Asherah poles. And so Asherah, or however you say her name, was kind of this fertility goddess in this Canaanite society. And over again, the Israelites start kind of incorporating Asherah poles into their worship and erecting these poles, and scholars debate about what they actually look like or whatever. And I'm not saying that Canaanite Asherah poles are like the American flag, but what you see are echoes, right? you see similarities where these objects of devotion, of cultural conformity, of deference to some great institution or God for being the provider of our security, right? Keep us safe, make us prosperous, and we imbue these things into these objects. This flag, it is the symbol of our strength and of our culture and our unity and our greatness. And I mean, that's what all flags are. And we're part of this tribe, and that's my identity, and I'm America first, right? Rather than child of God first. And so in my mind, with Israel and the Asherah poles, it was a question of conflicting allegiance. That's all it really boiled down to. And over again, when God says, I'm a jealous God, and you shall have no other gods before me, it's about allegiance. It's about loyalty. So why in the world would we pledge allegiance to anything but God and even fall off that kind of straight and narrow path the slightest in any way that might cause us to seek our strength from the arm of flesh? To think that government programs and largesse and policies and education and healthcare and subsidized housing and all these things are the reason for our safety and security. We need to depend on God, not on the arm of flesh. And it's the traditions of our fathers that inculcate us into thinking that the arm of flesh is appropriate and that we can intertwine it with our faith. And like Neal A. Maxwell said, have one foot in God's kingdom and one foot in Babylon. Keeping, as he called it, a summer cottage in Babylon that we could visit on occasion. There's an article I want to read. I only found this last night. I found so much of this interesting. So it's a few paragraphs. But what's especially troubling to me is you see in many Christian churches, almost, especially during the Trump era, leaning into this nationalistic reverence. Flags everywhere, right? People who for 4th of July don't even talk about Christ in their church. It's all just patriotic stuff and this intentional melding of the two. And it is this civic religion. It is this Caesarian promoted alternative religion that gives people meaning and identity and purpose and faith and hope for security and provisions and comfort and all these things. And it has its traditions, its pageantry, its books, its temples. It is counterfeit. And that's not to say that everyone who pledges allegiance is an idolatrous, whatever, right? That's not the point here. The point is to identify our weakness so we can talk about if we're doing anything wrong, not to condemn, not to criticize those who haven't caught the vision of this yet or haven't analyzed their own traditions of their fathers, or who do so and still come to the conclusion that it's okay. I can respectfully but strenuously disagree with those who still feel these things are okay after they've reviewed all of these different arguments. Fine. This is not meant to criticize or condemn. It's meant to encourage us to do what the scriptures are asking us to do and abandon the traditions of our fathers. Well, what are they? Have we ever sat down as a church, as a family, as a community, and tried to list out what our traditions of our fathers are? With sincerity and really scrutinizing things? I think, kind of like mote and we've got a mote in our eye or beam, or I always get those two confused, right? We're so willing to look at other countries and their grievances, but the biggest problem with this political tribalism that the pledge encourages and inculcates, since we pledge allegiance to our republic and all that it stands for, supposedly, is that we overlook, as with any tribe, you overlook the sins of your own tribe and you amplify the sins of the other, right? Everything that the other side does wrong is horrible. But you do not scrutinize your own actions because that would mean that it would be a bad reflection on you. If your tribe suffers, right? If your tribe is in the wrong, that means you're in the wrong. And no one wants to be in the wrong. Therefore, we are so generous in forgiving and overlooking all of the horrible things our tribe does, but we amplify those of another. It's what leads to the Mitt Romneys of the world saying, as he has many times, right? No apologies. America is great. I don't care what's been done in the past. We will never apologize. And that is just ridiculous in my mind. I think it's ridiculous in God's mind too, if I'm so bold as to say something like that. Okay, so here's this article. This was written in 1997. And the background of this is that there were many states that had laws on the books to prohibit the so-called desecration of the flag. In the post-Vietnam era, there were a lot of protests where people would burn flags. So then all these states passed laws making that a crime. Well, then these cases get challenged in court and overturned 5-4 in the Supreme Court. So then Congress comes in and passes a federal statute, anti-flag desecration statute, right? Much like the flag code says that the flag is a living thing, whatever the heck that means. And they say, you may not desecrate. Well, what does desecration mean? I think this article is gonna mention. So Congress comes in and says, all right, you can't desecrate the flag. Gets challenged in court. The same Supreme Court votes the same way, 5-4, overturns the federal anti-desecration flag statute. So now the only path forward under this system of law is a constitutional amendment. So time and time and time again, Congress has proposed a constitutional amendment. It has never achieved the 2/3 majority it needs in each house to then be sent to the states for ratification. Typically it gets those votes in the House, always fails in the Senate. And so this article was written during a time when that amendment was being proposed again. This was 1997. It's been proposed since. The last time, if my research is correct, that it was proposed was in 2006, and it was sponsored by Orrin Hatch. So here, this clear back in 1997, this was an op-ed written by someone in response to this constitutional amendment to use the force of government to physically or financially punish someone who happened to burn or otherwise desecrate a piece of cloth that they owned that was painted with dye in a similar way as to look like a symbol that others revere. So this guy says, he says, to a historian, this religion... Okay, let me back up. This amendment is an act already passed by the House and now before the Senate to ban flag desecration. America's new civil religion is a spiritualized nationalism worship of the United States itself. To a historian, this religion seems new because it is only a little more than a century old. The former civil religion, established in colonial times, was rooted in Christianity, particularly the Protestant variety. Governments wrote biblical injunctions into law, levied taxes to pay the salaries of Protestant ministers, and punished people for failing to attend church. Did you know that about history? This old religion has not entirely lost its hold. Schools and government offices still close on Sundays and Christmas, and as recently as 1954, Congress injected the phrase "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance. So there's the specific date that we referenced earlier in the 1950s. Since the time of the Revolution, however, democracy has rapidly eroded the power of Christianity as the civil religion. Democrats like Thomas Jefferson insisted that it was a violation of religious freedom for one group of people, even if the majority, to impose their religion on another. Defending the civil liberties of dissenters, Democrats tried to separate church from state. Not Democrats like those today. Back in the day, Democrats actually believed in civil liberties and things. Gradually, fitfully, they succeeded. Church doctrine was now out of the schools. And after the Revolution, state governments stopped their direct funding of churches and enforcement of church doctrines. Massachusetts was the last to do that. Parenthetically, Massachusetts was the first state, because of Horace Mann, his efforts, to have compulsory education, and then it spread from there. A lot of bad stuff has come out of Massachusetts, including Mitt Romney. In time, public schools ceased to inculcate Protestant doctrines. Catholics, Jews, atheists, and eventually even Native Americans no longer were forced to participate in someone else's religion. In 1962, the Supreme Court forbade officially organized prayer in public schools, saying that it violated the First Amendment by pressuring students to participate in worship they might not believe in. As the old civil religion declined, however, the new one, nationalism, grew. The central event in its development was, as we discussed earlier, the Civil War. Southerners thought they had a right to secede from the United States and create another nation. Northerners insisted on preserving the Union. The North won, and the belief that the United States is sacred and inviolable has been increasing ever since. In 1892, so we've already discussed some of this, a children's magazine published the first version of the Pledge of Allegiance and urged all schools to adopt it, thus teaching students that secession from the United States, one nation indivisible, as the pledge then expressed it, was heresy. That ritual caught on. By 1935, 18 states and hundreds of school districts in other states required children to do the flag salute. Even Southerners joined in. In 1931, Congress declared the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. Unlike Francis Scott Key's original title, Defense of Fort McHenry, the anthem's revised title focused on the vivid, concrete image of the flag, the Star-Spangled Banner. An anthem is a religious song, and its performance is a religious ritual. People interrupt their normal activities, devote their attention to the ceremony, and respectfully take off their hats, just like in church. The fact that this occurs at every Red Sox game only emphasizes how ubiquitous the civil religion has become. I guess this was published in I don't even know sports. Where's Red Sox? Is that Boston, I think? Anyways, he says, the icon of the United States is the stars and stripes, and that flag, therefore, has become a holy object like a Bible or a crucifix. Americans are taught to salute Old Glory. Glory, too, has religious connotations. Never to sully it, and always to plant it in the position of highest honor. Thou shalt have no other flags before it. Strictly speaking, the flag is a woven image rather than a graven one. Yet Americans' willingness to bow down before it reflects a certain indifference to the Bible's second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, and reflects also the triumph of the new faith. When members of Congress vote to ban flag desecration, they are explicitly stating that every American ought to worship the United States. To desecrate something is to desacralize it, to treat it as if it were not sacred, but profane. Therefore, to speak of flag desecration is to imply that the flag is a holy object and that the republic for which it stands is also. It was not always this way. He's almost done. In the early years of the Republic, there was so little concern for the flag that there was not even a standard number of stars and stripes. Until a law was passed in 1818, federal buildings displayed flags carrying any number of stripes from 9 to 18. A flag was not a sacred symbol, but a useful sign denoting federal property. The U.S. Navy flew the stars and stripes over ships, and the Army flew it over forts, but the Army carried a different flag, an eagle on a field of blue, into battle until just before the Civil War. That war made a difference. When Southerners bombarded Fort Sumter, Northerners called that the beginning of a war against the flag and aroused their own patriotism by singing, "Rally round the flag, boys." For the first time, the Army carried Old Glory into combat, as in the movie Glory. Christian churches flew flags, and large numbers of civilians owned and displayed Old Glory. Here's how a Boston woman described flag worship at a rally in 1864. Old men with white hair and tearful faces lifted their hats to the national ensign and reverently saluted it. Young men greeted it with fierce and wild hurrahs, talking the while in terse Saxon of the traitors of the Confederate States who had dragged in the dirt this flag of their country. Never before had the national flag signified anything to me, but as I saw it now kissing the skies, all that it symbolized as representative of government and emblematic of national majesty became clear to my mental vision. It was this holy flag that had been insulted. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then he says, the flag salute performed in public schools today reveals the state of American civil religion. Students are required to engage in formal, organized reverence of the United States. Meanwhile, they are forbidden to engage in formal, organized reverence of God. The school is the church of nationalism, or at least its seminary. Or to put it another way, the United States has become God to many Americans. A constitutional amendment banning flag desecration would make the new civil religion official. Nothing would be sacrificed if it were ratified, except the First Amendment and the Second Commandment. So that was written by James Hijia, who was a professor of history at UMass Dartmouth. And I thought a lot of those comments were spot on and echoed my own. I have no problem with the flag itself. with symbols, with understanding the history of the flag, and anything like that. The question is, are we pledging allegiance to it and to the government, and saying that we are a one nation under God when we don't act like it, and saying that we're indivisible when we're absolutely not, and saying that we promote liberty and justice for all when most people pledging allegiance to the flag don't even attempt to try for that, and many of them are actively trying to violate it. The pledge is hollow. It's hollow. It's without meaning, and it carries its own inherent dangers of being an idolatrous act. I don't pledge allegiance to a government. People in countries that this government is fighting with are my brothers and sisters. We are all children of God. We're supposed to be building his kingdom, not our local tribe. And so I don't want to rally behind banners that separate us and that encourage one Caesar to attack another Caesar and all their minions to go fight and create more chaos. I want to find ways to repudiate those identities, to shirk the traditions of our fathers, to let those scales fall from our eyes and recognize that in many cases, these things inhibit us from seeing things, I think, the way God wants us to. I was programmed as a kid. I didn't know any different. My parents didn't know any different. That's just the way it was. It was the traditions of our fathers. Pledging allegiance to the flag was just what you did. And until I learned the history and the intent behind those who created the Pledge of Allegiance, those who encouraged it to be required for children, those who pushed for the creation of compulsory schooling where pledges could be compulsory, until I learned what these people were up to and the way they wanted to shape our country into some type of socialist dystopia, until then, I was ignorant. But once I learned those things, I came to understand that I do not want to serve their ends. Their ends are completely at odds with the ends that I think God has in store for me and for all of us and has told us to do. I don't want to further their goals and their aims. Quite the opposite. I want to frustrate them. And so for me, it starts by refusing to participate in those pledges and processes, in making sure that I have as much as I can an eye single to the glory of God, that I do not become idolatrous in any way, even well-intentioned, even if minimal. And obviously that's a work in progress, and I am not perfect. But it started for me in many ways by recognizing that pledge was a significant thing in my life that I didn't even understand, and that was furthering goals that are at odds with what I think God wants to do for me. Where you take all this information for your own life and for those in your family is up to you. But it's in scrutinizing these things that we begin to understand a little bit better what beliefs and actions we have inherited from past generations and have found completely appropriate to pollute Christ's church and intermix with our faith. Now, others may come to a different conclusion and feel like there is no intermixing and things are just kosher and you can do all these things. I disagree, but that's okay as long as we're being far more thoughtful about this and not just going through the motions and doing what our fathers have inculcated in us and what's expected of us without being intentional about understanding these things and prayerfully considering if in any way our allegiance to God is being compromised by pledging it elsewhere. Have a good Sunday.